Hello everyone, and welcome to another attempt at this stream where I would like to talk to you about how the game Crusader Kings 3 attempts to represent the Middle Ages, medieval times, the period of history that it represents. And I hope everything's coming through. Everything should be coming through properly. Okay. Now, what I wanted with this is not really to talk about the thing that comes first to mind when opening a game like this, and that is the map. Thanks, Shadow. The map is almost unimportant because you cannot get an accurate map of the Middle Ages. You especially cannot get this well-defined map of the Middle Ages because the relationships between the different entities, between the different actors, weren't this well-defined. These borders are not what we would see back then. And we would not see these, so to say, these firm divisions between the different realms. Because different people, different actors, different feudal vassals could be vassals of multiple seniors. For instance, like the lords of the island of Kurukir, who were vassals to both Venice, as they are in the game now, vassals to the kings of Hungary, and vassals to the Habsburgs and dukes and archdukes of Austria. Or in a far more controversial example, how the King of England, who was at the same time the Duke of Normandy, was, through the title of the Duke of Normandy, the vassal to the King of France. Hello, random. So, these are things that the game can't represent very well because it needs a firm footing. Oh, okay. We'll fix that. Okay, I hope that's better. What instead the game does well is how it focuses the game on the characters, on the people, on the dynasties, because that's not only who the main movers are of history in this period, but they could very well be the main movers. But it's not just the big kings of kings and emperors who are part of this. It's also their smaller vassals who could, in joint action and through various alliances and marriages and so on and so forth, move the course of events in a different direction. The Middle Ages is not just dependent on these various social constructs of familial alliances, dynasties. It's also very much dependent on personalities that are placed in positions of prominence and power. This is in part also based on how medieval history is derived from chronicles, in that the chronicles will write about the deeds and actions of various individuals, so the game at the same time represents that aspect of how medieval history is told. this is also not to dismiss another factor that came into making a game like this, which is also the fantasy game genre, which fantasy and role-playing game genre, which adds in various other factors and traits and things that, well, gamify history, so to say. And this aspect of history being taken at an almost individual level, the sources being almost made for individuals, sometimes, many times, literally made for individuals, is not just something that's happening in medieval Europe, it's something that happens also in other parts of the world. Of the world, especially when you take a look at Chinese history or Japanese history, it's also very much driven by individual actors, and the focus is on them during this period. The other aspect of the game that's kind of not that important for the gamification of things is when we get to such things where there is disagreement over even amongst amongst historians, such as the order in which some kings and the rulers became kings and rulers, and who was related to whom. For example, if we take the Croatian royal family, which has certain aspects of, they've taken one of the possible interpretations of the Croatian royal family tree and put it into the game, but that's not really that... It's not really that important, because you'll get disagreements over that even in general history. There's no single view on those things. Same with, as I've said, the borders. These borders are not set firm in the Middle Ages as they might be later. Especially in this area, especially around 1699, when the border is incredibly well defined. These borders are not... they change, they ebb and flow, especially with the messes of ownership and everything. The changes in river flows and other aspects, etc., etc. I'm not exactly going to play the game that much here, because I've chosen a landless character more to observe, and I've started at the latest start date in order to, well, examine the game a bit more. And one of the other aspects that is important, well, one of the very important aspects that has, I think, yet to be that well fleshed out in Crusader Kings is, well, the role of religion and the papacy, because it was far more fleshed out in the previous iteration of the game title, Crusader Kings 2, when it still has to be updated in this, because you still can't do much with the historical aspects of the mechanics of religion. It does, however, however, a very flexible mechanism for, for game purposes, in what you can attempt to change if you want to. Also shows the differences in societal values and how things were treated. For instance, the difference between male and female adultery here. One being frowned upon, the other being criminal. A thing that was looked at more in this game right now, a thing that developers looked at more in this game right now, was the aspects of culture and how these different cultures developed different values, how different cultural values developed, and try to somehow emulate that by giving you different bonuses and buffs and or debuffs in some cases to those things. It's not, again, it's also very much yours to manipulate for the gamification aspect of it, but the thing that sort of starts to go a bit, how to say, I'm struggling for words right now, sorry. There are still many things that have not yet been implanted into the game to make a true simulation, but the thing that does... But the things that make up some of the aspects of the medieval world, such as the focus on... Well, the focus on, or at least the feudal realms... Well, when I say feudal realms, I mean... Where's the button? Sorry, feudal Europe, is that the focus is very much on ownership of the land. You are only really a player in these sorts of areas if you own land, which is a very important aspect of medieval society that becomes even more important in Eastern Europe than it does at later stages in Western Europe. Again, that is partially due to the amount of nobility that arises in between East and Western Europe. For instance, the nobility of France and England will be in very low numbers because inheritance will start to get concentrated in only one member of the family, usually the eldest son. While in Eastern Europe, you will still have the more to the division of land between all of the sons, even inheritance of titles upon birth instead of upon death. Everybody who would be born into, for instance, a family of a count in the later in the realm of Saint Stephen, Hungary and Croatia, would be a count. Every member of the Habsburg imperial family was an archduke upon birth. Nobody needed to die for them to inherit that, to have that title. Unlike the nobility in England, where you didn't inherit to a title until the death. Instead, you were given a honorary lesser title of the parent to the son, but the son still didn't own land. And one thing that the game does not depict well, but this is perhaps the onus is also on the player, is in that very aspect of division of land. We are almost directed by the game to strive for... no, not that. I might need to change character for this. We're almost directed by the game to strive for that form of direct succession. There it is. That form of succession to go towards primogeniture, to focus our inheritance onto one son, onto one child, instead of keeping the partition of our lands between the various children. And this is a very, I'm not sure it's a historical it's not, it's historic, I'm not sure it is historical, because we are sort of forcing this idea of centralization good, and the more lands under the direct control of the crown good. The problem is that something was clearly happening where the medieval kings and rulers did not see the world that way. For instance, in game times, is he born yet? Ah, there he is. If, for instance, Andrew the Second. Anyone who's seen his history series knows he has an episode dedicated to him. He's still a little whippersnapper right here, but when Andrew brings in his quote-unquote new institutions into the realm and starts to divide the royal estates and control of the royal estates between his, well, cronies, between his close friends and allies, it is sort of interpreted backwards to be a very stupid move. But the question is, why does he do that? What would make him think that that is a good thing to do? The thing was that, of course, the various aspects of the king's domain were given to different vassals to control. That had been a thing for centuries. They were just given for before Andrew, roughly before Andrew. It starts to change around Andrew's time, but before then, those offices were given for those lands and titles and incomes were given for the office, for the duration of someone's time while they held that office. And the game doesn't model that aspect of, well, of Hungarian history specifically. But what starts to change in King Andrew's time is that some of these things, some of those lands, some of those things become hereditary. They become owned. They become attached to one single family, one single owner. And these are sorts of things that some suspect might have been brought over from with the culture of chivalry and knights and the almost Arthurian culture that's being brought over from Western Europe, where in the 12th, 13th century, where there is this culture of a close band of friends around the king who will be loyal to him, who will obey him, who will serve him very loyally. And that is one aspect as to why King Andrew decides to give over these vast estates to very close friends, which naturally causes big problems, when especially the minor and middling nobility revolt against this behavior of the king and make him sign the Bull of 1222 and so on and so forth. The other aspect that's attached to this is that this idea to divide the land that your family owns is still present even later. It's when we get to the 15th century, we still see this in the 15th century. We see this in the 15th century with King Casimir IV of Poland, where he is seeking. Actually, we even see it before. We see it with King Louis I, where they are seeking to attempt to divide the lands they rule between their children equally. They are searching to have each of their sons have a crown. And it's sort of an almost alien idea to us, especially when you play a game like this, as to why would you do that? Why would you intentionally divide your lands? It's the big question of the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. Why did Charlemagne decide to divide his empire into four parts between all of his heirs instead of attempting to solidify it under one? It's that part that the game cannot sort of represent, and we, the player, will not allow it to go that way because we know that that would make us a weaker entity in the game instead of a stronger one. The thing that plays into this is, of course, the various shenanigans we try to pull with marriages and inheritances and murders. Things that are always suspected to have maybe happened in certain situations to force the inheritance of one realm to the other, and so on and so forth. But sometimes I think the things that people try and pull off in the game are an exception rather than the rule historically. Because if you... Sorry. Because... Well, you can plot out this entire succession. You can marry your child to the king of Poland's daughter, ensure she inherits the throne, and get that inheritance through very nefarious means. But again, we are going into aspects that go far more into questionable chronicle writing and rationalizations of past actions, sometimes written decades, if not centuries, after the fact, than something that we can confirm and be assured that that actually happened. For instance, the situation we are currently covering in the series is the centuries after this, but the inheritance of Spain by the Habsburgs, which sorry about that. If there was noise, I'm sorry. Which I suspect was not as intentional as is sometimes represented. Well, I don't think it was intentional at all. It was a very specific set of circumstances that I don't think anybody expected to happen. Because you needed the deaths to result in the Habsburg succession to Spain to result in a very particular order at very particular times. Which, of course, you can engineer in the game for your own purposes, but might not have actually happened historically. Of course, people had they had mechanisms to prevent those things from happening historically. Such as the loyalty of their courtiers and their staffs, and perhaps don't have your spy master hate you is sound advice, or your food taster or cupbearer. The thing that the game tries to represent quite differently is that some realms were what I described in Hungary as certain families, certain people being given lands that were attached to offices. was far more the case, was almost the case of what was happening in the Byzantine Empire, which is governed by very different rules in the game, where certain people are given control over certain parts of the empire, not in perpetuity, but in for a set period of time, or for a set duration while they hold office, while they hold that office, that theme, as it was known. And that is governed through very different rules than the feudal realms, which require an attachment to land. This one, you don't really need... The game, interestingly, while you are in constant jeopardy of losing everything you have if you lose land in a feudal realm, which was historically the case. If you lost all of your land in Hungary, you would no longer be considered part of the nobility. While in these sorts of cases, you would still be a noble of a noble family with your own house and estate, but you wouldn't be exactly in danger of losing that status if you, well, if you lost everything, if you lost your office. Okay. Any questions while I grab a drink of water? Sorry if the model bugs out there. Okay. Okay, while we are still in Europe, there are some aspects of the game that are handled that are, well, I mean, yet to be handled in some aspects. It is the merchant republics and the theocratic princes and how they will, in that they are still uncontrollable, and you can't play as them as you could. Well, you can't play as the merchant princes as you could in the previous title, but that's probably coming very soon if the developer diaries are to be well, if I'm reading enough through the lines in some things. And I would like to see the merchant republics get a far more prominent role, because Venice is a big player in the Mediterranean, like a big historical factor. Far more than Genoa, in some respects, because Venice is the one that sets the whole Fourth Crusades debacle in motion. It is the one that has the various outposts and things across the Mediterranean to trade, to have an almost monopoly on the flow of spices from the Indian Ocean into Europe. And talking about that, there is also a new aspect that they've added with the addition of China, which is the... Is there a map mode for it, or am I just going to have to search for a button or something? because an addition was made of the Silk Road. It flows information and goods and economy from China to Europe. Now, this is primarily the events that I've encountered in game are primarily based upon that old, the event where a couple of monks went all the way from Byzantium to China and stole some silkworms in a hollow cane, and brought them all the way back to Byzantium in order to start up silk production there, instead of having to pay the very high prices that were the result of the various middlemen attempting to make profits across the Silk Road. And it is that aspect is far more, that stealing of knowledge aspects is from what I've seen far more played on than visit Silk Road visit Silk Road markets in order to learn some different innovations that are the result of that can only be developed in China, so to say, are the result tied to the Han culture and so on. But the Silk Road played a far more prominent role, especially with regards to the merchant republics and trade, because it was in effect just an entire network of middlemen selling goods to and fro along its path. And of course, with every good that changes hands along this road, the price of course increases until it reaches its end destination, usually Venice or Constantinople, which then gets passed on to the buyers in Europe. But that's the sort of the reason why that the path around the Cape of Good Hope is found, and the Portuguese start shipping spices and goods directly from India to Europe, and it just destroys this entire network that had lasted for centuries. But I'm getting a bit off topic. Sorry. Another aspect that the game tries to represent in some way is the Crusades, and I think it does that quite well for the chaos that they are, because it would take, if we started up a game, it would take a while to even get to a crusade, but the Crusades are a mess, because it is just everyone going at it by themselves to try and carve out a part of the Holy Land for a member of their family. Or, it is in the game mechanics, you carve it out and try to install a member of your family as the King of Jerusalem, or whatever other kingdom that the Crusaders launched on. But if you can't get the top position, then you can get a lower one. And I think the chaos that results, the complete uncoordination, was far more historically accurate than some players would like it to be. Which is why for a long time, and I think still, most Crusades fail miserably. Fail completely and utterly miserably in the game. There is also the far more story-driven aspects when you get to the quote-unquote events of the Fourth Crusade that destroyed the Byzantine Empire for a while, but they are far more driven by the game's tailor-made events than they are by the mechanics themselves. Which isn't exactly a bad thing, but because you do need to find that solution for a event that happened but was fairly unique and had a very specific set of circumstances behind it. That you most likely, if you play a game, you won't get that certain aspect. Because I think the biggest lesson that you get while playing... I think the biggest historical lesson that you get while playing Crusader Kings 2 is that how specific of a timing of events sometimes needed to happen for the world to result in the world we have today. Because if the order of people dying changes, if who marries who changes, you can wind up with a very different world than the one, that resulted historically. And that is the sort of aspect and the benefit that comes from these sorts of games that try to emulate history, but again, it's games, so you're primarily supposed to have fun from it, but that is probably the aspect of learning about history that the game can teach you very, very well. Who you marry, when do you marry them, when does somebody die, what is the role of succession within a kingdom, and in what order does somebody succeed. You also have that aspect of who was the king, what was somebody's personality, what ailments did they suffer from, what I think sometimes there are cultural aspects that will take into account those personality traits and other things to make people more or less likable depending on who they are or what they are. And the likability of a person is also one of the factors you have to pay attention to in the game, because your popularity, or your king's popularity, is, especially among his family, is very important as to how you control or how your brothers and how your siblings react to. Does somebody support your siblings, and so on and so forth. Because the realm of Hungary and other realms also, as we have seen, especially interestingly under the native dynasties, are fraught with instances of civil war and infighting. We see it in Croatia with the Pripimirovic dynasty. We see it in Hungary with the Arpad dynasty. Almost every generation or so, but there is serious infighting between the various members of the family, specifically for the throne. It sort of changes when we get to the... it sort of changes when we get to the 14th century and the quote-unquote the foreign dynasties in this part of the world, but those dynasties also don't rule for as long as the Arpads and Trpimirovics did, but you don't get that long dynasty until the Habsburgs. But when we get to the Habsburgs, especially the Habsburgs after Frederick III, we are talking about a very different dynasty that is functioning under very different rules from other European nobility. What's your opinion on the new revised chronology of Croatian rulers? In the game? Let's see. Oh, hold on. Well, maybe better to look at the Dukes of Croatia. Yeah. I think so. Yeah. Turbine II didn't exist. Michael Kreshimir is the successor of Tomislav, etc. Oh, I mean, the chronology of the Croatian rulers and the Croatian kings. I mean, the connection seems to be all right on my end. I've been getting no warnings. So, the chronology of the Croatian rulers is something that is going to change with almost everyone who writes about it, because there is no firm footing for... We're on very unfirm footing for the successors to Tomislav and what happens in the early 11th century, especially with the one or two Stephens that are present. For instance, no, it's not depicted here, but it's very much down to the individual historian and how they interpret the sources. I'm not that familiar with, and things like that can hang on almost on a phrasing of in a chronicle or a letter or some other things that will convince someone of one succession onto the other. We don't really have those cases where unless it's spelled out in like the Historia Salernitana or like it was on the gravestone of Queen Yelena. We don't really have that firm of a footing for quite a few of the kings, like what happens between Tomislav and Miroslav Krešimir II and so on, because you have also some rulers that are interpreted to go by different names at points, like you get that you get the problem with Stephen Držislav, where is it Stephen Držislav and then it's Stephen 1, 2, 3, or is 1 and 2, or is it Stephen the first Držislav and then Stephen 2 and 3? And you have that aspect with also Miroslav Krešimir, where sometimes in some interpretations have been made where one name of Miroslav is interpreted to have been either Tomislav or his son Trpimir to be their second regnal name, sort of. Second Christian name instead of the Croatian Slavic one. So it's you can get into a big muddle with how you interpret it, and it's all based on the same series of sources and the different readings of them. things will, of course, ebb and flow and change, but they are all based on the same footing. So unless, which is an almost impossibility, we find a new source, it's not... it's going to keep getting debated and revised over and over again. But it's still not exactly something that is too relevant. I mean, you get the same models with names and titles, and it's a matter of historical interpretation and debate, and it's always going to get revised, and you're going to get differing opinions on that. I'm not really willing to put my foot in one way or the other. Because sometimes you will have the different entities call people by a certain title in that they might not have had officially. Well, not officially. I mean, the problem is we don't really also know that the titles that we can apply in the 9th and 10th centuries are the same meanings of titles that we get in the later centuries. Like, there is a strong belief that the Croatian rulers from the princes, from Prince Trpimir onwards, were referred to with the Croatian word for kralj or kral, while in Latin they were addressed with the dukes or rex. It's the early medieval world especially is very messy. It also comes to mind with the whole 1100th anniversary of the coronation of King Tomislav, in that I mean, the game has also added the mechanics of royal coronations, which we don't know how firm of a thing they were in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, and if they were only reserved for the head honchos in Germany and the Empire. Well, the Carolingians and the Etonians, and the only reserved for the Emperor, or if they were certainly an evolution of tradition. And there is, of course, the chronicle tradition of saying that the various kings and kings of Poland, Bohemia, Hungary were also crowned in the 11th, 12th centuries, but again, that is those are later written chronicles, which we can't attest to the veracity, because they always hearken on to a tradition, sort of saying that every king of Hungary was crowned in Székesfehérvár, which, other than the chronicles, there is no firm evidence of that, but the tradition and the tradition of legitimacy of kings is there and is almost necessary. So there's a very strong possibility that it happened, but there is enough reason to doubt it. It's all a matter of interpretation and debate, but in those sorts of cases you also run into the problem of, if you eliminate those sources for some reason, you are left with nothing else. Like, you can doubt a source, but at some point there is a realization that if you eliminate it, you have nothing. And it's sort of, and I think there's this period in the mid 20th century where we uh where was I? You're left with nothing. Sorry, I've lost myself now. The thing that was added in recent parts of the game was that the mechanics for the steppe nomads they made mechanics for the steppe nomads, which is, I mean, the problem of the history of the nomadic tribes is that we derive a lot of their behavior from anthropological and sociological and those sorts of studies that reach for centuries, and of course stories and things, and of course a lot of it is writings of the people that the different tribes harassed, like from the Chinese to the Byzantines to the Europeans. But that's always, and I mean, I'd say it's an interesting aspect of history, trying to study the very much undocumented, but you can achieve something with that. The one thing that, of course, they've added into the latest update to the game added the yeah, yes, those are, I mean, again, it is up to, it's slightly above my pay grade to comment on. I mean, I'm only relaying what I've learned of things, but I don't feel myself confident enough to judge the medieval sources' veracity on some aspects. Especially when it comes to titles and things that aren't very... well, things that aren't... things that aren't really that well spelled out, where there is, of course, room for doubt. But honestly, I mean, of course, the other problem with all of that is that we are used to repeating the things we learned first. So we don't tend to talk about, so we don't tend to easily change our minds on that. I mean, from what I understand, the Turkish archives are still being scoured, but a lot of it has been very thoroughly researched, and especially especially in the last few decades and things. By my understanding of things and how I've been told by the professors and researchers have gone into that, a lot of it has been documented and researched, and some of it may be waiting interpretation or reinterpretation, but it has been very thoroughly researched, and a lot of Turkish archives have been scoured because they are incredibly good sources for like taxes and documents and things that would give you information on the population and those sorts of things. The interesting part of that is sometimes when you look at the not things that those tax documents mention, but what they don't mention at some points, which is sometimes related to the various nomadic tribes that crisscrossed the military frontier. So at one point somebody will show up in the tax documents, another point they won't, and then again and again and again. But as I understand it, a lot of the things that we know about have been yes, the thing that the map is, you can always debate a medieval map. You can, if you go for any map that is made, well, before 1699, it is going to be very inaccurate in its fine outlines and things. The de jure map modes, as they are called, I think are far more there to enable the player to strive for something, rather than as these official things that were official borders. Because these are, a lot of people will take objections to quite a few things if they and they do take objections to quite a few things. Especially like the de jure empires are very specifically there to have the player strive for something instead of representing an actual historical idea in most cases, like Carpathia, West Slavia, the Baltic Empire, and so on. There are historical entities here, but they are far more they're far more there for the gamification than they are to represent history, because the medieval map will ebb and flow and change as... the main problem is that the various persons and vassals living along the borders would usually swear vassalage to both sides of the border if they could get away with it, in order to ensure their own safety. So sometimes the spans of kingdoms and empires is overlapping, unless there is like a firm royal fortress or something that is under control of the crown directly. Which you get far more in the later centuries, like the 14th, 15th century, with the establishment of port systems and those sorts of things. The What I do like about the game is that a lot of its mechanics lend itself well to also emulating the histories of the other parts of the world, like China and Japan, where histories and things are also written and covered in a almost very personal aspect, and the interpersonal relationships between the various actors. The slight problem that we have with some of those histories is also some of them are very sometimes hard to find, not well, some aren't familiar or known or translated very well, and some are just again later chronicles and fiction, or sometimes you don't even get history that is written. Like a lot of Japanese history in the starting periods of the game, when you get to the earlier start dates, is still the Heian court era, which is still focused on literature and poetry and so on, and those sorts of things, and you only now get to those aspects where the samurai start to take over the military samurai system starts to take over the government of Japan, and the rise of the military warlords and the shogunate, where you start getting a far more firm history of what's happening, because there's much more action happening between and infighting happening with the Japanese, and the various literate people are writing things about it, instead of just quote-unquote fighting the barbarians in the north, quote-unquote, which was the case for a lot of the time in a lot of earlier Japanese history. Chinese history is also Hrdčak is very much not is I think it's not behind a paywall. It is very much open and available. Some of the links might not work, and some of them might link to other institutions and things which are behind paywalls, but a lot of the things from Hrdčak are open, and I've used them for my research. Oh, wait. They might be locked behind like an institutional paywall, now that I think about it. So you'd probably want to search for them from a library or some sort of that for a more official place that might have access to it. Like, I still get a lot of the online research that is paywalled by going to the computers in the National University Library that have access to it, to those things. So that's helpful. I can't remember right now. It's sort of I've gotten so used to having the I've grown very used to having the institution, not the institution, pay for the access and open up the paywall, that I can't remember which was and wasn't behind paywalls. But I think a lot of Hrdčak is open. Oh, where was I? Oh, yeah. The thing that is of course representing Chinese history and is the most famous aspect of Chinese history is the quote-unquote the mandate of heaven, or the dynastic cycle that as they say in game, with what institutes the rise and fall of dynasties, and how they it's a very gamified version of this. It's a very point-based system, but it also lends me hope for developments in the game for a European to changes in Europe for like the diets of the nobility and things, because this sort of mechanic where you get to state your allegiance to a certain faction within the Empire is sort of one thing that's needed for like a almost early proto-parliamentary system, or the system of the diets that exists in Europe. Because right now the mechanics of the nobility are very restricted to to the elected monarchies, like the Holy Roman Empire or early England with the where the nobility gets a vote on who to elect as their future ruler. I mean, in the Holy Roman Empire, it's specifically the eight prince electors. What do you mean 8 prince electors? 1, 2, hold on. Ah, okay, there's a few of them that probably shouldn't be there. Okay, yeah, there's a few of them that probably shouldn't be there, but... Okay, actually, yeah, the prince electors haven't been firmly selected in this... during this time period. It's a far more later development of the 14th century. But I mean, it's still restricted to just 8 princes, but okay, there's some shenanigans going on there because that's not the usual prince electors. And what what's going on here? I'm pretty sure. I know it's his highest title. I know it's the guy's highest title, but the Duke of Istria is in Innsbruck. Sorry. Just notice the goat there and had to laugh. I don't think Istria is yet even a firm title yet. It's still, I think, what would be known as... I mean, it might... I'm trying to remember, but it's something that was like known as the literal, or... I actually need to look that up for when the name Istria was first used, because now it's confusing, because when I talk about the literal, I'm talking about the crown land that encompassed Istria, Carinthia, Trieste, and so on. But it might have been like... But that same literal divided into the other crown lands, one of which was Istria, which had its own diet and things. So it would need to... I do need to look that up now. Well, later. I mean, hopefully, I do hope, I do want things to be available far more than they are. Because, like, getting sources locked up behind paywalls and things is just a nightmare. Hello, Viking. Yes, as I was saying, the actions on how the nobility can influence the monarch that could be in the future, probably should be in the future, represented with some sort of early parliament or diet mechanics, is now only really represented in the elective monarchies. I can't demonstrate that right now because I need to play far more of the game than I have. Some aspects that I can't really comment on because I don't know enough is the Arab world and Central Asia because it's still an unfamiliar area to me. I mean, even India is still an unfamiliar area to me. I'm I'm sadly far more acquainted with the history of the East India Company than India itself, but it was a it is a very divided land with a lot of different aspects to it for a lot of its history, and a lot of the things you don't get, that you don't really understand because you're not attached to it in as much of a way when you try and study it. Same thing with the oceanic sort of area. And when you get, like, even when you start getting, like, the various Balkan princes and princelings that emerge with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, it's always a bit of a mess. Even, I mean, it's even after the collapse of, I mean, the Byzantine Empire first creates a bunch of little entities that cover, well, that separate from the Byzantine Empire and the Latin Empire and everything. And then the rise of the Serbian Empire that starts to gobble up everything because everyone just surrenders to the new overlord, and then that collapses in on itself very quickly and then creates this whole mess that the Ottomans have a very easy time walking into. Well, quite easy time walking into. But it's always a bit of... the feudal anarchy is always a mess, and you get that in the Balkans. You get that to a point also in Italy, except sometimes the names are probably more familiar and far more written about than in this sort of areas, because a lot more of the Italian histories and chronicles would be shared around and survived. Same thing with Germany. There are some things that... Oh, I've been streaming for over an hour. I didn't notice. There are some things that the game tries to represent, like, through very special quote-unquote situations and event windows that have their own specific mechanics attached to it, which such as the Iberian struggle, and having the ability to direct it in several different ways instead of just the historical Reconquista way. But it is an interesting way to try and allow for the effect of the thing, to allow the players to change history. Although I'm never too happy with those sorts of mechanics that need to be added on to the usual mechanics of the game that let it affect history, sort of. I'm far more of a fan when the base mechanics of the game will allow history and things to develop sort of on their own instead of being prompted by special events and things. If you can understand what I mean. Let's see. I think I've talked about a lot of what I wanted to talk about. Any questions for now? That I can answer while I still have a map and a bunch of family trees available to me. Sorry, that was just me pouring water, if that bothered anyone. Let's see now. Let's see now, actually. I wanted to check something out. No. Hold on. One thing I'm sure they... Okay, this is interesting. Interesting that the King of Croatia title is added as primary for people here. Okay. Gaze is in prison? Hold on, I'm sure the game also had... Oh, hold on, I need to change. If I want to change that, if I want to check that out, I need to... I swear the game had a... Hold on. There it is. That works better. Okay. Well, if there are no... if there are no further questions, or no questions at all now, I think I've talked about what I wanted to talk about, because I have quite a few hours in this game already, and I wanted to just... Well, I mean, I wanted to use it for a historical talk. And I'm trying to think about what I haven't talked about as of yet and what I think is sort of important, but I think the most valuable thing this game does is again make you think and consider that aspect of history that results from these various marriages and relationships that happen in Europe, because that is one of the main mechanics of the game. How these different orders of succession and inheritance, and like these different orders of succession and inheritance, and how they affected history, because you have very much control over that. And I mean, sometimes you don't have control over anything, but you see it sort of result in a very different map of Europe, depending on how it happens. The other aspect that I think is very important is that the medieval world is very interpersonal. It is very much based on who knows who, when, what, where, and this applies across the globe. It's not so much about institutions and things. It's very much about individuals and their personalities, and that is how medieval history is written. That's how it's written in the chronicles. It's about what was someone like, who liked who was married to who, and so on and so forth, who went to war with whom. It's all very much made on a personal basis. What was the connection to the Croatian and Serbian? What Bosnian connection to Croatian Serbian nobility in this time frame? I think it's. I mean, I'm not that familiar with a lot of the family trees, but there were marriages. Like these were families that in this time frame from the that married into even the like the Dukes of Rashka married into the Hungarian royal family. Like these are certainly people that would have intermarried and exchanged properties and communicated and so on and so forth. Like it's definitely like there was connection because that's what the noble families of the area did. And I mean the aspects that it would have made people, I mean the high positions and the local wealth would have made marriage prospects very high. Naturally, you are far more inclined, like you are far more inclined in, I think, in this time period to make marriage connections to people that are sort of geographically close to you. And only in later periods you do some things that connect you to a far more European-wide net after you've solidified some sort of foothold in the area. Some sort of base for your family. But it's sort of... I'm not that familiar with the... Well, I'm not that overly familiar right now with all of the different connections and marriages that the nobility would have had, but it is within the geographical proximity that people would have had connections and married and so on and so forth. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and I just wanted to talk about a few things about the game, and I think that is enough for now. It was far more of a historical commentary on the game than it was actually playing it, though I might consider that at some point in the future, but probably on the other channel, but we'll see. Thank you everyone for coming, and have a good rest of your evening, and good night.